Can a massive pile of bricks really save a man when the wind begins to carve the life out of the prairie? And is the price of survival truly the loss of every comfort a home is supposed to hold? The town of Endurance was built on the logic of the flat prairie, where a house was a frame of pine and the stove was a small iron box. When Aleksei began hauling cartloads of heavy clay and thousands of kiln-fired bricks to his homestead, the mockery started before the first wall was laid. Thomas, the most respected builder in the county, stood in the mud, watching Aleksei clear his living space for a foundation that would swallow nearly the entire room. "You are building a tomb, not a house, immigrant," Thomas scoffed, his voice carrying the weight of the town as collective arrogance. "A stove belongs in the corner, not in the heart of the home." Aleksei said nothing, his hands calloused and stained with red clay, his eyes fixed on the geometry of the labyrinthine flue system he was crafting. He knew what they did not: that wood is a liar, and only the thermal mass of the earth itself could hold the truth of heat. The town watched him with pity, then disdain, as he sacrificed his floor space for the sake of a hulking, silent structure that seemed to serve no purpose in their modern world. They laughed as he spent his final coins on mud and stone while they invested in timber and glass. But then came the night the sky ripped open. The temperature plunged to 45 degrees below zero, and the prairie wind turned every conventional cabin into a freezing, drafty cage. 4 days later, the wind was still screaming, but the town was silent. A dark, frozen shape appeared in the white void, staggering toward the bluff. It was Thomas, his face blackened by frostbite, dragging his children through the snow. He reached the door of the immigrant-esque cabin and fell against the wood, gasping for air. When Aleksei swung the door open, the wave of heat that hit the freezing man was so intense it felt like a physical blow. Thomas looked inside, and his jaw went slack. He saw no fire roaring in a grate, no frantic feeding of wood. He saw only the monolithic, silent mass of the Russian stove, radiating a steady, life-giving warmth that defied everything the builder had ever known. How could one man, alone, hold the very heart of the sun in a room filled with clay, while the rest of the world turned to ice? The air inside Aleksei's cabin held the scent of wet earth and ancient, unyielding memory. He worked in the dim light with raw clay, a material that felt more like kin than mere earth. This was the foundation of everything he had learned from his grandfather in the old country. The Russian stove was not a mere appliance, but the heartbeat of the home, a silent guardian against the absolute void of a Siberian winter. While the settlers of Endurance obsessed over pine planks and imported glass, Aleksei saw only the terrifying fragility of their lives. He remembered the bitter nights of his youth, watching his grandfather feed the fire just twice, yet waking up to a house warm as a summer morning. The physics of his craft were alien to the men who claimed to own the prairie. Heat is not something you chase with desperate flames, Aleksei had tried to explain to the town blacksmith, a man whose arrogance was as dense as the cold iron he hammered. Heat is a substance you must catch, trap, and hold within the walls themselves. The blacksmith had only laughed, pointing to his own iron stove, which roared for an hour and went stone dead as the embers faded. Aleksei remained silent, knowing the iron stove was a thief that stole heat and vented it into the sky, while his massive Russian stove would be a miser, hoarding every unit of energy in its brick-lined soul. He spent weeks in the dirt, mixing clay with sand and straw until his hands were as rough as the mortar he applied. He was building a thermal battery, a dense, immovable core that would absorb a fire's energy and radiate warmth long after the flames had vanished into soot. His neighbors, peering through his door with pity and mockery, dubbed him the clay-maddened hermit, while they busied themselves with the hollow, vanity-driven task of building civilized homes that were little more than decorated cages waiting for the frost. "You are wasting your life, immigrant," they would call out, their voices dripping with a superiority they would soon regret once the sky changed color. A house needs light and space, not a pile of dirt in the middle. Aleksei remained silent. He was busy mastering the complex, hidden labyrinth within the brick, a series of internal tunnels designed to pull hot gases through the heart of the Russian stove, ensuring that by the time the smoke reached the flue, it would be cold and spent, its energy surrendered to the bricks. Every evening, exhausted and coated in gray dust, he would collapse against the rising wall of his creation. The winter wind outside began to howl with a new, sharper hunger, as if it knew a rival was being born. He felt the air thicken with the suffocating promise of a killing freeze. The townspeople were busy wrapping their windows in thin, useless cloth, preparing for a common storm. Aleksei was preparing for a siege. He knew the profound difference between a winter that could be endured and one that demanded a total sacrifice. As he laid the final layer, the mockery ceased, replaced by a quiet unease. They could see that something fundamental was shifting in the air. The silence of the prairie was not peace. It was the intake of breath before a scream. And when that scream arrived, he would be the only one standing still. Building the Russian stove was no mere labor. It was a slow, agonizing war against the elements and the relentless ticking of the clock. Aleksei worked with the precision of an architect and the devotion of a monk, ignoring the blisters bursting on his palms as he handled the abrasive kiln-fired bricks. To create this thermal titan, he utilized a specific mortar blend: clay, river sand, and straw, beaten into a paste that would harden like volcanic stone. He constructed the internal labyrinth, known as the oboroty, with obsessive care, creating winding paths that forced hot gases to travel deep through the masonry before escaping. While the locals saw only a hulking obstruction that choked their living space, Aleksei understood the fundamental physics. By forcing the smoke to linger, he could extract every degree of warmth from a single fire. While Aleksei hauled clay, the town remained locked in a cycle of desperate, short-sighted survival. Thomas, the town's most prominent builder, would often stand at the edge of the property, arms crossed in suffocating judgment. "You are burying your life in that heap, immigrant," Thomas would sneer, his pity masking his own ignorance. Aleksei didn't bother to argue. He knew their frame houses would become wooden sieves, while his cabin would transform into a fortress of radiant heat. As November deepened, the sky took on the bruised color of an inevitable siege. The Russian stove now dominated the room, forcing Aleksei to move around it with reverent grace. He had built a wide sleeping ledge on top, a sanctuary where the bricks would hold heat for hours, an ironclad promise that he would not freeze in the dark. When the first bone-chilling frost struck, the town relied on their small, inefficient iron stoves, which required constant, back-breaking feeding for only fleeting relief. Aleksei, meanwhile, finished the final seal on his masonry. Surveying his monumental work, a reservoir of stored potential, he felt a profound strength. He had sacrificed his space and reputation for this moment. The storm was coming, and he was the only one in endurance who had built an unbreakable wall against the void. The atmosphere shifted violently as December brought a cataclysmic winter. The air became so sharp, it felt like inhaling broken glass. In endurance, the folly of relying on thin-walled frames and iron stoves manifested in desperate failures. As temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, timber houses acted as frozen sieves, leaking warmth into the prairie sun-caring maw. With quality timber exhausted, Settlers scavenged wet sagebrush and fence posts, creating choking smoke and providing only fleeting heat. Inside, families huddled in blankets, their breath blooming like white plumes as the frost pulled warmth from their very bones. Their iron stoves, once prized, turned against them. They demanded constant feeding, and the moment the fire dimmed, the rooms plummeted into an icy, unlivable void. Aleksei, meanwhile, lived in profound tranquility. His massive Russian stove stood as a silent, monolithic sentinel against the encroaching death. By feeding the fire a small, controlled amount of dry wood, the internal labyrinth of bricks began its vital process of thermal accumulation. The stove acted as a living battery, drinking in the energy and holding it within its clay-bound core. Long after the fire died and the flue was closed, the surface remained hot, radiating a steady, gentle warmth that allowed Aleksei to thrive in a pocket of deliberate comfort while the town surrendered to the freezing dark. The contrast was absolute. When Aleksei stepped out, he faced a monochromatic wasteland where the wind erased all signs of progress. The townspeople began to notice his home's strange endurance. They saw no desperate, billowing smoke, only a house that remained still, yet never succumbed to the ice. Their former arrogance died, replaced by a gnawing envy. They were burning their entire winter wood supply in weeks, while Aleksei's small, neat pile remained largely untouched, a testament to the efficiency of his machine. He was no longer just the clay-maddened hermit. He was a source of mounting confusion. They could not comprehend how a man sat in a fortress of stone, unaffected by a blizzard that was tearing shingles from their roofs and burying their doors. Every creak of their own frozen beams served as a reminder of their precarious existence, and every glance toward his bluff felt like a question they feared to answer. They were experiencing the weight of absolute isolation, realizing too late that their pride had led them to build against nature rather than within it. Aleksei stood alone in his sanctuary, the heat from the bricks a physical reminder that in a world governed by the laws of physics, only those who respect the cold can truly command it. The winter isolation became absolute, turning the prairie into a vast, silent tomb. While endurance fought a losing battle against the frost, Aleksei lived in a reality defined by the steady, unyielding hum of his Russian stove. The physics of his creation worked with the grace of a natural cycle. A handful of fuel allowed the massive brick core to store heat deep within its clay structure. While the gale assaulted the outside world, the cabin remained a pocket of serene, controlled stability. Aleksei spent the claustrophobic days in deep reflection, feeling the pulse of the stove against his back as he rested on its ledge, a grounding, transformative sensation. Inside, there was only the soft, rhythmic radiation of heat, a gentle pressure that kept the encroaching chill at bay. He was not merely waiting for spring. He was navigating the physical reality of the world through patience and intellect, rather than fighting it with vanity. The psychological weight of the winter began to crush the town. The settlers were no longer just cold. They were breaking under the strain of constant, paralyzing fear. They lived in a state of ticking clock panic, knowing that if their iron stoves died for even a few hours, the frost would claim their homes. The arrogance that once fueled their dismissal of Aleksei had been replaced by a desperate realization of their own inadequacy, the fatal cost of their pride. Aleksei sensed this collective collapse. Occasionally venturing out to clear his door, his movements were deliberate and focused, his calloused fingers working with mechanical efficiency to ensure his cabin's thermal integrity remained absolute. He knew that even a moment of lethargy could be fatal. Though an outcast, he possessed the only secret that mattered. Survival was an engineering feat, not a moral struggle. Back in his sanctuary, Aleksei looked at the monolithic brickwork with a peace the settlers would never comprehend. He had stripped away the unnecessary, the furniture, the luxury, the need for approval, and become the most resilient soul in the territory. Outside, the wind reached a demonic shriek, but inside, the air remained still. He had created a zone of defiance, a quiet monument to the truth. When you understand the mechanics of the world, you stop being a victim of the storm and start being its master. While the town suffered, here, in the heat of the clay, there was only the steady, life-giving heartbeat of the Russian stove. The town's pride collapsed not through erosion, but through a sudden, harrowing surrender to the Arctic reality. By the 6th day of the blizzard, endurance had become a collection of freezing, isolated graves. The architecture that once fueled the builder's arrogance had proven a fatal miscalculation. The wind stripped roofs from houses and drove snow through every seam, leaving interiors as desolate as the tundra. Thomas, once the town's proudest builder, was now a shivering shadow. His home had failed him. His iron stove had gone cold, its fuel exhausted and chimney choked with ice. With his children huddled beneath blankets, he realized with crushing clarity that he had spent his life building for mild weather, not for the killing cruelty of the winter. Driven by instinct, Thomas made a choice that shattered his remaining dignity. He began to crawl toward the bluff. Battling through white, suffocating chaos, he fought the frost that threatened to turn his body into brittle timber, moving only through the sheer terror for his kin. When he reached Aleksei's cabin, he collapsed against the door as a frantic, frozen mass of desperation. Aleksei opened the door, and the contrast was violent. Where Thomas had been in a tomb of ice, the cabin was bathed in the steady, profound warmth of the Russian stove. It was a pervasive, comfortable embrace that held the air in suspension. Aleksei pulled the broken man and his children inside, his face a mask of silent efficiency. Thomas, barely able to process the reprieve, collapsed to the floor, his gaze fixed on the towering mass of bricks in the center of the room. The Russian stove was silent, yet it radiated an energy that defied Thomas's understanding. He watched in disbelief as Aleksei served broth without even needing to feed the fire, as the monolithic heart of the oven was already saturated with enough thermal energy to last through the next day. The builder, who had once sneered at the immigrant's heap of mud, now stared at the brick surface with shamed wonder. In that warmth, the arrogance of the town and its social hierarchy dissolved. Thomas realized he had spent his life fighting nature with useless tools, while Aleksei had built a bridge to survive it. As color returned to his frozen fingers, Thomas knew their entire way of life had been exposed as a hollow, dangerous lie. The storm broke on the 8th morning, leaving behind a landscape of frozen, silent drifts. While the town lay buried, its livestock lost and homes gutted, those who had sought refuge at the bluff emerged as survivors, preserved by the very structure they had once mocked. Thomas stood overlooking the ruins, his arrogance stripped away by the cold. Approaching Aleksei, he spoke with profound humility. "I called it a tomb. I was wrong. You didn't build a stove. You built a way to endure the world as it actually is." Aleksei simply nodded, having never sought victory, only survival. As the town began the grueling process of digging out, its spirit shifted. The settlers no longer boasted of their dominance. Instead, they gathered in silent respect before the clay-covered monolith. Thomas became the primary apprentice, recording the dimensions of the Russian stove to teach others how to prioritize thermal mass over status. Endurance was undergoing a fundamental transformation. By the following winter, the landscape was altered. 11 new shelters incorporated the principles of the Russian monster, proving that cold was a natural fact to be managed through physics, not a foe to be fought with vanity. The town's architecture, once a symbol of separation from the land, became a testament to their integration with it. Aleksei lived out his years as a respected figure, passing away in the cabin he had crafted. His funeral was attended by those he had saved, and the cabin was eventually preserved as a monument to a wisdom nearly lost to frontier arrogance. The earth remains a constant battery, holding the heat that sustains life even when the world above turns to ice. Aleksei's legacy is the enduring truth that the wise do not fight nature, but listen to it. The massive clay structure still stands, a silent testament that when civilization froze, the brick endured, and in the heart of that heat, the town found the strength to survive.